Incidents in the life of Madame Blavatsky, compiled from information supplied by her relatives and her friends, and edited by A.P. Sinnett, author of Esoteric Buddhism, The Occult World, etc., etc., with a portrait reproduced from an original painting by Hermann Schmeichan, London. George Redway, York Street, Covent Garden, 1886. Chapter 7. From Apprenticeship to Duty. Probably the years 1867 to 1870, if the story of these could be properly told, would be found by far the most interesting of Madame Blavatsky's eventful life. But it is impossible for me to do more at present than indicate that they were associated with great progress in the expansion of her occult knowledge, and passed in the East. The 2 or 3 years intervening between her residence at Tiflis and the period I have named were spent indeed in European travel, and there would be no necessity for holding back any information concerning these, the latest of her relatively aimless wanderings, of which I might have gained possession. But no watchful relatives were with her to record what passed, and her own recollections give us none but bare outlines of her adventures. In 1870 she came back from the East by a steamer via the then newly opened Suez Canal, and after spending a short time in Piraeus, took passage for Spezia on board a Greek vessel, which met with a terrible catastrophe, and was blown up by an explosion of gunpowder and fireworks forming part of the cargo. Madame Blavatsky was one of a very small number of passengers whose lives were saved. The castaways were rescued with no more than the clothes they wore when picked out of the water, and were momentarily provided for by the Greek government, who forwarded them to various destinations. Madame Blavatsky went to Alexandria and to Cairo, where, amid much temporary inconvenience, she waited till supplies of money reached her from Russia. I have headed this chapter From Apprenticeship to Duty, because that is the great transition marked by the date of Madame Blavatsky's return to Europe in 1870. Till that period, her life had altogether been spent in the passionate search for occult knowledge, on which her inborn instincts impelled her from her earliest youth. This had now come upon her in ample measure. The natural-born faculties of mediumship, which had surrounded her earlier years with a coruscation of wonders, had given place now to attributes for which Western students of psychic mysteries at that date had no name. The time had not come for even the partial revelations concerning the great system of occult initiation as practiced in the East, which has been embodied in books published within the last few years. Madame Blavatsky already knew that she had a task before her, the task of introducing some knowledge concerning these mysteries to the world. But she was sorely puzzled to decide how she should begin it. She had to do the best she could in making the world acquainted with the idea that the latent potentialities in human nature, in connection with which psychic phenomena of various kinds were already attracting the attention of large classes in both hemispheres, were of a kind which, properly directed, would lead to the infinite spiritual exaltation of their possessors, while wrongly directed, they were capable of leading downward towards disastrous results of almost commensurate extent. She alone, at the period I refer to, appreciated the magnitude of her mission, and if she did not adequately appreciate the difficulties in her way, she had at all events no companion to share her sense of the fact that these difficulties were very great. Probably she would be among those most willing to recognize, looking back now upon the steps she took in the beginning, that she went to work the wrong way. But very few people who have had a long and arduous battle in life to fight, especially when that fight has been chiefly waged against such moral antagonists as bigotry and ignorance, would be in a position at the close of their efforts to regard their earliest measures with satisfied complacency. The only lever which, as the matter presented itself in the beginning to Madame Blavatsky's mind, seemed available for her to work with, was the widespread and growing belief of large numbers of civilized people in the phenomena and somewhat too hastily formed theories of spiritualism. She set to work in Egypt, finding herself there for the moment, to found a society which should have the investigation of spiritualistic phenomena for its purpose, and which she designed to lead through paths of higher knowledge in the end. Some among the many misrepresentations which have made her life one long struggle with calumny from this time onward arose from this innocently intended measure. Because she set on foot her quasi-spiritualistic society, she has been regarded as having been committed at that date to an acceptance of the theory of psychic phenomena which spiritualists hold. It will have been seen, however, from the quotations I have given from her sister's narrative that, even on her first return from the East in 1858, she was emphatic in repudiating this view. One of the persons who sought Madame Blavatsky's acquaintance in connection with this abortive society was the subsequently notorious Madame Coulon, attached at that time to the personnel of a small hotel at Cairo, who afterwards, finding her way with her husband, in a state of painful destitution, to India, fastened herself but too securely on Madame Blavatsky's hospitality at Bombay, only to repay this in the end by rendering herself the tool of an infamous attack made upon the Theosophical Society in the person of its founder by a missionary magazine at Madras. Of this I shall have occasion to speak again later on. The narrative of the period beginning in 1871, on which I am now entering, has been prepared with a good deal of assistance from Madame Blavatsky herself, from writings by relatives and intimate friends of her later years. It would be tedious to the reader if this were divided into separate fragments of testimony, and I shall therefore prefer, except in some special cases later on, to weld these narratives into one, and the use of the plural pronoun we will hereafter sufficiently identify passages which have a composite authorship. In 1871, Madame Blavatsky wrote from Cairo to tell her friends that she had just returned from India and had been wrecked somewhere en passant, near Spezia. She had to wait in Egypt for some time before she returned home. Meanwhile, she determined to establish a Société Spirite for the investigation of mediums and phenomena according to Allan Kardec's theories and philosophy, since there was no other way to give people a chance to see for themselves how mistaken they were. She would first give free play to an already established and accepted teaching, and then, when the public would see that nothing was coming out of it, she would offer her own explanations. To accomplish this object, she said, she was ready to go to any amount of trouble, even to allowing herself to be regarded for a time as a helpless medium.
They know no better, and it does me no harm, for I will very soon show them the difference between a passive medium and an active doer,
she explains. A few weeks later, a new letter was received. In this one, she showed herself full of disgust for the enterprise, which had proved a perfect failure. She had written, it seems, to England and France for a medium, but without success. Ex désespoir de cause, she had surrounded herself with amateur mediums, French female spiritists, mostly beggarly tramps, where not adventuresses in the rear of Monsieur de Lesseps' army of engineers and workmen on the Canal of Suez.
They steal the Society's money,
she wrote.
They drink like sponges, and I now caught them cheating most shamefully our members, who come to investigate the phenomena by bogus manifestations. I had very disagreeable scenes with several persons who held me alone, responsible for all this. So I ordered them out, The Société Spirit has not lasted a fortnight. It is a heap of ruins, majestic, but as suggestive as those of the pharaoh's tombs. To wind up the comedy with a drama, I got nearly shot by a madman, a Greek, who had been present at the only 2 public séances we held, and got possessed, I suppose, by some vile spook.
Footnote. This literal translation of a letter written by Madame Blavatsky to her aunt 14 years back shows that she never changed her way of viewing communication with spirits for physical phenomena, as she was accused of doing when in America. End footnote. She broke all connection with the mediums, shut up her société, and went to live in Boulac, near the museum. Then it seems she came again in contact with her old friend, the captain of mysterious fame, of whom mention has been made in connection with her earliest visit to Egypt at the outset of her travels. For several weeks he was her only visitor. He had a strange reputation in Egypt, and the masses regarded him as a magician. One gentleman who knew him at this time declared that he had outlined and predicted for him for 25 years to come nearly all his, the narrator's, daily life, even to the day of his death. The Egyptian high officials, pretending to laugh at him behind his back, dreaded and visited him secretly. Ismail Pasha, the Khedive, had consulted him more than once, and later on would not consent to follow his advice to resign. These visits of an old man who was reputed hardly ever to stir from his house, situated at about 10 miles from town, to a foreigner, were much commented upon. New slanders and scandals were set on foot. The skeptics who had, moved by idle curiosity, visited the Société and witnessed the whole failure, made capital of the thing. Ridiculing the idea of phenomena, they had, as a natural result, declared such claims to be fraud and charlatanry all round. Conveniently inverting the facts of the case, they even went the length of maintaining that instead of paying the mediums and the expenses of the society, it was Madame Blavatsky who had herself been paid and had attempted to palm off juggler tricks as genuine phenomena. The groundless inventions and rumours thus set on foot by her enemies, mostly the discharged French women mediums, did not prevent Madame Blavatsky from pursuing her studies and proving to every honest investigator that her extraordinary powers of clairvoyance and clairaudience were facts and independent of mere physical manifestations, over which she possessed an undeniable control. Also that her power, by simply looking at them, of setting objects in motion and vibration without any direct contact with them, and sometimes at a great distance, instead of deserting her or even diminishing, had increased with years. A Russian gentleman, an acquaintance of Madame B., who happened to visit Egypt at that time, sent his friends the most enthusiastic letters about Madame Blavatsky. Thus he wrote to a brother officer in the same regiment, a letter now in the possession of her relatives, and from which we translate,
"She is a marvel, an unfathomable mystery. That which she produces is simply phenomenal, and without believing any more in spirits than I ever did, I am ready to believe in witchcraft. If it is after all but jugglery, then we have in Madame Blavatsky a woman who beats all the Boscos and Robert Houdins of the century by her address. Once I showed her a closed medallion containing the portrait of one person and the hair of another, an object which I had had in my possession but a few months, which was made at Moscow, and of which very few know, and she told me without touching it."
Oh, it is your godmother's portrait and your cousin's hair. Both are dead.
And she proceeded forthwith to describe them, as though she had both before her eyes. "Now, godmother, as you know, who left my eldest daughter her fortune is dead 15 years ago. How could she know?"
and so on. In an illustrated paper of the time, there is a story told of Madame Blavatsky by another gentleman. He met her at a table d'hôte with some friends in a hotel of Alexandria. Refusing to go with these to the theatre after dinner, they remained alone, sitting on a sofa and talking. Before the sofa there stood a little teapoy, on which the waiter had placed for Mr. N a bottle of liqueur, some wine, a wineglass, and a tumbler. As he was carrying the former with its contents to his mouth, without any visible cause, the glass broke in his hand into many pieces. She laughed, appearing overjoyed, and made the remark that she hated liqueurs and wine, and could hardly tolerate those who used them too freely. The story goes on.
You do not mean to infer that it is you who broke my wineglass? It is simply an accident. The glass is very thin. It was perhaps cracked, and I squeezed it too strongly. I lied purposely, for I had just made the mental remark that it seemed very strange and incomprehensible, the glass being very thick and strong, just as a verre at liqueur would be. But I wanted to draw her out. She looked at me very seriously, and her eyes flashed.
"What will you bet?"
she asked.
"That I do not do it again?"
Well, we will try on the spot. If you do, I will be the first to proclaim you a true magician. If not, we will have a good laugh at you or your spirits tomorrow at the consulate. And saying so, I half filled the tumbler with wine and prepared to drink it. But no sooner had the glass touched my lips than I felt it shattered between my fingers, and my hand bled, wounded by a broken piece in my instinctive act at grasping the tumbler together when I felt myself losing hold of it.
Entre les lèvres et la coupe, il y a quelquefois une grande distance, which translates, between the lips and the cup, there is sometimes a great distance.
She observed sententiously, and left the room, laughing in my face most outrageously.
During the latter years,
Madame de Jelihovsky states,
many were the changes that had taken place in our family. Our grandfather and our aunt's husband, who had both occupied very high official positions in Tiflis, had died, and the whole family had left the Caucasus to settle permanently in Odessa. H.P. Blavatsky had not visited the country for years, and there remained in Tiflis but myself with my family and a number of old servants, formerly serfs of the family, who once liberated could not be kept without wages in the house they had been born in and were gradually being sent away. These people, some of whom owing to old age were unable to work for their living, came constantly to me for help. Unable to pension so many, I did what I could for them. Among other things, I had obtained a permanent home at the city refuge house for 2 old men, late servants of the family, a cook called Maxim and his brother Piotr. Once upon a time, a very decent footman, but at the time of the event I refer to, an incorrigible drunkard who had lost his arm in consequence. That summer we had gone to reside during the hot months of the year at Manglis, the headquarters of the regiment of Erivan, some 30 miles from town, and Madame Blavatsky was in Egypt. I had just received the news that my sister had returned from India, and was going to remain for some time at Cairo. We corresponded very rarely, at long intervals, and our letters were generally short. But after a prolonged silence, I received from HPB a very long and interesting letter. A portion of it consisted of fly sheets torn out from a notebook, and these were all covered with pencil writing. The strange events they recorded had been all put down on the spot, some under the shadow of the Great Pyramid of Cheops, and some of them inside Pharaoh's chamber. It appears that Madame B had gone there several times, once with a large company, some of whom were spiritualists. Footnote: some most wonderful phenomena were described by some of her companions as having taken place in broad daylight in the desert when they were sitting under a rock, while other notes in Madame Blavatsky's writing recorded the strange sight she saw in the Cimmerian darkness of the king's chamber when she had passed a night alone comfortably settled inside the sarcophagus. End footnote.
"Let me know, Vera,"
she wrote,
whether it is true that the old Piotr is dead. He must have died last night or at some time yesterday. The date on the stamp of the envelope showed that it had left Egypt 10 days previous to the day on which it was received. Just fancy what happened. A friend of mine, a young English lady and a medium, stood writing mechanically on bits of paper, leaning upon an old Egyptian tomb. The pencil had begun tracing perfect gibberish, in characters that had never existed here, as a philologist told us, when suddenly, and as I was looking from behind her back, they changed into what I thought were Russian letters. My attention having been called elsewhere, I had just left her, when I heard people saying that what she had written was now evidently in some existing characters, but that neither she nor anyone else could read them. I came back just in time to prevent her from destroying that slip of paper as she had done with the rest, and was rewarded. Possessing myself of the rejected slip, fancy my astonishment on finding it contained in Russian an evident apostrophe to myself. Barishnya, meaning little or young miss. "Dear Barishnya," says the writer, "help, oh help me, miserable sinner, I suffer, drink, give me a drink, I suffer. From this term Barishnya, a title our old servants will, I see, use with us too, even after our hair will have grown white with age. I understood immediately that the appeal came from one of our old servants, and took therefore the matter in hand by arming myself with a pencil to record what I could myself see. I found the name Pyotr Kucherov echoed in my mind quite distinctly, and I saw before me an indistinguishable mass of grey smoke, a formless pillar, and thought I heard it repeat the same words. Furthermore, I saw that he had died in Dr. Gorolevich's hospital, attached to the city refuge, the Tiflis workhouse where you had placed them both. Moreover, as I made out, it is you who placed him there in company with his brother, our old Maxime, who had died a few days before him. You had never written about poor Maxime's death. Do tell me whether it is so or not."
Further on followed her description of the whole vision as she had it, later on, in the evening when alone, and the authentic words pronounced by Pietro's spook, as she called it. The spirit was bitterly complaining of thirst and was becoming quite desperate. It was a punishment, it said, and the spook seemed to know it well, for his drunkenness during the lifetime of that personality.
An agony of thirst that nothing could quench, an ever-living fire.
As she explained it.
Madame Blavatsky's letter ended with a postscript, in which she notified her sister that her doubts had been all settled. She saw the astral spooks of both the brothers, one harmless and passive, the other active and dangerous.
Footnote: how dangerous is the latter kind was proved on the spot. Miss O, the medium, a young lady of hardly 20, governess in a rich family of bankers, an extremely modest and gentle girl, had hardly written the Russian words addressed to Madame Blavatsky when she was seized with a trembling and asked to drink. When water was brought, she threw it away and went on asking for a drink. Wine was offered her. She greedily drank it and began drinking one glass after another, until to the horror of all she fell into convulsions and cried for wine, a drink, till she fainted away and was carried home in a carriage. She had an illness after this that lasted for several weeks. HPB. End footnote.
Upon the receipt of this letter, her sister was struck with surprise. Ignorant herself of the death of the parties mentioned, she telegraphed immediately to town, and the answer received from Dr. Gorolovich corroborated the news announced by Madame Blavatsky in every particular. Piotr had died on the very same day and date as given in H.P. Blavatsky's letter, and his brother 2 days earlier. Disgusted with the failure of her Spiritist society and the gossip it provoked, Madame Blavatsky soon went home via Palestine and lingered for some months longer, making a voyage to Palmyra and other ruins, whither she went with Russian friends. Accounts of some of the incidents of her journey found their way into the French and even American papers. At the end of 1872, she returned in her usual way without warning and surprised her family at Odessa. Chapter 8. Residence in America. In the beginning of 1873, Madame Blavatsky left Russia and went in the first instance to Paris. By this time, the psychic relationship between herself and her occult teachers in the East was already established on that intimate footing which has rendered her whole subsequent life subject to its practical direction. It is unnecessary to inquire why she adopted this or that course. We shall rarely discover commonplace motives for her action, and frequently she herself would be no better able to say why she might be at any given moment arranging to go here or there than the merest stranger present. The immediate motive of her proceedings would be the direction she would receive through occult channels of perception, and for herself, rebellious and uncontrollable though she had been in earlier life, an order from her master was now enough to send her forward on the most uninviting errand, in patient confidence that good results would ensue, and that whatever might be thus ordered would assuredly prove for the best. The position is so unlike any which the experience of ordinary mundane life supplies, that I may usefully endeavour to explain the relationship which exists in connection with and arising out of occult initiation in the East, between a pupil, or chela, of the esoteric or occult doctrine, and his teacher, master, or guru. I have known many chelas within the last few years, and I can speak on the subject from information that is not exclusively derived even from that source. The primary motive which governs people who become chelas is the desire to achieve moral and spiritual exaltation that may lead directly to a higher state of being than can be hoped for by the unassisted operation of the normal law of nature. Referring back to the esoteric view of the human soul's progress, it will be seen that people may often be impelled, as Madame Blavatsky was, for instance, from childhood, by an inborn craving for occult instruction and psychic development. Such people seek initiation under the guidance, as it were, of a commanding instinct, which is unlike the intellectually formed purpose to accomplish a spiritual achievement that I have assigned above to chelas as their primary motive. But in truth, the motive would be regarded by occultists as the same at different stages of development. For the normal law of nature is that a soul having accomplished a certain amount of progress along the path of spiritual evolution in one physical life, one incarnation, will be reborn without losing the attributes thus acquired. All these constitute what are loosely spoken of as inborn tendencies, natural tastes, inclinations, and so forth. And thus, whether a chela is then, for the first time, seeking initiation or watched over by a guru from his last birth, the primary motive of his effort is the same. And this being his own spiritual advancement, it may be that if circumstances do not require him to play an active part in any work in the world, his duty will, to a large extent, be concentrated on his own interior life. Such a man's chief obligation towards the public at large, therefore, will be to conceal the fact that he is a chela, for he has not yet, by the hypothesis, attained the right to choose who shall and who shall not be introduced to the mysteries. He merely has to keep the secrets entrusted to him as such. On the other hand, the exigencies of his service may require him to perform tasks in the world which involve the partial explanation of his relationship with his masters, and then a very much more embarrassing career lies before him. For such a chela, however perfect his occult communications may be through the channel of his own psychic faculties between himself and his masters, is never allowed to regard himself for an instant as a blind automaton in their hands. He is, on the contrary, a responsible agent who is left to perform his task by the light of his own sagacity, and he will never receive orders which seriously conflict with that principle. These will be only of a general character, or, where they refer to details, will be of a kind that do not, in occult phrase, interfere with karma. That is to say, that do not supersede the agent's moral responsibility. Finally, it should be understood in regard to orders among initiates in occultism that the order of an occult guru to his chela differs in a very important respect from the order of an officer to his soldier. It is a direction that in the nature of things would never be enforced, for the disregard of which there could be no positive or prescribed penalty, and which is only imposed upon the chela by the consideration that if he gets an order and does not obey it, he is unlikely to get any more. It is to be regarded as an order because of the ardour of obedience on the side of the chela, whose aspirations, by the hypothesis, are wholly centred on the masters. The service thus rendered is especially of the kind which has been described as perfect freedom. All this must be borne in mind by any reader who would understand Madame Blavatsky and the foundation of the Theosophical Society, and must be rigorously applied to the narrative of her later life. A constant perplexity arises, for people who are slightly acquainted with the circumstances of her career, from the indiscretions in connection with the management of the Theosophical Society which she has frequently fallen into. How can it be that the Mahatmas, her occult teachers and masters, whose insight is represented as being so great, whose interest in the theosophical movement is said to be so keen, whose wisdom is vaunted so enthusiastically by their adherents, permit their agent, Madame Blavatsky, with whom it is alleged they are in constant communication, to make mistakes which most people in her place would have avoided, to trust persons almost obviously unworthy of her confidence, to associate herself with proceedings that tend to lower the dignity of her enterprise, to lose temper and time with assailants who might be calmly ignored, and to spend her psychic energy in the wrong places, with the wrong people, and at the wrong moments. The solution of the puzzle is to be found entirely in the higher spiritual aspects of the undertaking. The Theosophical Society is by a great way not the only instrument through which the Mahatmas are working in the world to foster the growth of spirituality among mankind, but it is the one enterprise that has been confided, in a large measure, to Madame Blavatsky. If she were to fail with it, the Mahatma energy concerned would be spent not in trying to bolster up her failure, but in some quite different direction. If she succeeds with it, the principles of moral responsibility are best vindicated by leaving her to struggle through with her work in her own way. A general on a campaign, sending an officer to perform a specific duty, is mainly concerned with the result to be gained. If he thinks he can promote this by interfering with fresh orders, he does so. but by the hypothesis a Mahatma interfering with his officer is throwing into confusion the operation of the laws of nature which have to do with the causes, efficient on a plane above this of physical incarnation, that are generated by what we call moral responsibility. Of course, it is open to people who know nothing of Eastern occultism, nor of superior planes in nature and so forth, to put all this aside and judge Madame Blavatsky's action by commonplace prosaic standards. But it is not reasonable for the considerable number of people who in various ways are quite ready to profess belief in the Mahatmas and in the reality of that occult world in which Madame Blavatsky is regarded by most theosophists as having been initiated, to say, in spite of these beliefs, that the action of the Mahatmas in leaving Madame Blavatsky to make mistakes and trust the wrong people and so forth is unintelligible. It is not unintelligible in principle, even though, as I have indicated a page or two back, Madame Blavatsky will sometimes receive orders, the immediate motive of which she does not understand, but obeys nonetheless. This condition of things does not violate the rule about not converting a responsible chela into a blind automaton. Such interferences would never be found to take place under conditions which would discharge the agent of moral responsibility for the manner in which he might resume the guidance of his enterprise from the point to which obedience to the order received might have carried on or diverted him. No special interest attaches to Madame Blavatsky's brief residence in Paris in 1873, where she stayed with a cousin of hers, Nicholas Hahn, Rue de l'Université, for 2 months. She was directed to visit the United States and make that place for a time the scene of her operations. She arrived at New York on the 7th of July, 1873, and resided in that city, with the exception of a few weeks and months when she had to visit other cities and places, for over 6 years, after which time she got her naturalization papers. Although, as will have been seen from Madame de Jelihovsky's testimony, she was emphatic, even in 1858, in claiming for most of the phenomenon that took place in her presence a very different origin from that usually assigned to such phenomena by spiritualists. The experience of spiritualism and mediumship that she acquired in America greatly enlarged her views on this subject. In 1875, she wrote home,
"The more I see of mediums, for the United States are a true nursery, the most prolific hotbed for mediums and sensitives of all kinds, genuine and artificial, the more I see the danger humanity is surrounded with. Poets speak of the thin partition between this world and the other. They are blind. There is no partition at all except the difference of states in which the living and the dead exist, and the grossness of the physical senses of the majority of mankind. Yet these senses are our salvation. They were given to us by a wise and sagacious mother and nurse, nature, for otherwise individuality and even personality would have become impossible. The dead would be ever merging into the living, and the latter assimilating the former. Were there around us but one variety of spirits, as well called the dregs of wine, spirits, the relique of those mortals who are dead and gone, one could reconcile oneself with it. We can't avoid, in some way or other, assimilating our dead, and little by little and unconsciously to ourselves we become they, even physically, especially in the unwise West, where cremation is unknown. We breathe and devour the dead. Men and animals, with every breath we draw in, as every human breath that goes out makes up the bodies and feeds the formless creatures in the air that will be men someday. So much for the physical process. For the mental and the intellectual and also the spiritual, it is just the same. We interchange gradually our brain molecules, our intellectual and even spiritual auras, hence our thoughts, desires and aspirations, with those who preceded us. This process is common to humanity in general. It is a natural one, and follows the economy and laws of nature, insomuch that one's son may become gradually his own grandfather, and his aunt to boot, imbibing their combined atoms, and thus partially accounting for the possible resemblance or atavism. But there is another law, an exceptional one, and which manifests itself among mankind sporadically and periodically. The law of forced post-mortem assimilation, during the prevalence of which epidemic the dead invade the domain of the living from their respective spheres, though fortunately only within the limits of the regions they lived in, and in which they are buried. In such cases, the duration and intensity of the epidemic depends upon the welcome they receive, upon whether they find the doors opening widely to receive them or not, and whether the necromantic plague is increased by magnetic attraction, the desire of the mediums, sensitives, and the curious themselves, or whether again, the danger being signalled, the epidemic is wisely repressed. Such a periodical visitation is now occurring in America. It began with innocent children, the little Mrs. Fox, playing unconsciously with this terrible weapon. And welcomed and passionately invited to come in, the whole of the dead community seemed to have rushed in and got a more or less strong hold of the living. I went on purpose to a family of strong mediums, the Eddies, and watched for over a fortnight, making experiments, which of course I kept to myself. You remember, Vera, how I made experiments for you at Rugodevo, how often I saw the ghosts of those who had been living in the house and described them to you, for you could never see them. Well, it was the same daily and nightly in Vermont. I saw and watched these soulless creatures, the shadows of their terrestrial bodies, from which in most cases soul and spirit had fled long ago, but which throve and preserved their semi-material shadows at the expense of the hundreds of visitors that came and went, as well as of the mediums. And I remarked, under the advice and guidance of my master, that 1. Those apparitions which were genuine were produced by the ghosts of those who had lived and died within a certain area of those mountains. 2. Those who had died far away were less entire, a mixture of the real shadow and of that which lingered in the personal aura of the visitor for whom it purported to come. And 3. The purely fictitious ones, or as I call them, the reflections of the genuine ghosts or shadows of the deceased personality. To explain myself more clearly, it was not the spooks that assimilated the medium, but the medium, W. Eddy, who assimilated unconsciously to himself the pictures of the dead relatives and friends from the aura of the sitters. It was ghastly to watch the process. It made me often sick and giddy, but I had to look at it, and the most I could do was to hold the disgusting creatures at arm's length. But it was a sight to see the welcome given to these umbra by the spiritualists. They wept and rejoiced around the medium, clothed in these empty materialized shadows, rejoiced and wept again, sometimes broken down with an emotion, a sincere joy and happiness that made my heart bleed for them. If they could but see what I see, I often wished. If they only knew that these simulacra of men and women are made up wholly of the terrestrial passions, vices, and worldly thoughts, of the residuum of the personality that was. For these are only such dregs that could not follow the liberated soul and spirit, and are left for a second death in the terrestrial atmosphere that can be seen by the average medium and the public. At times, I used to see one of such phantoms quitting the medium's astral body, pouncing upon one of the sitters, expanding so as to envelop him or her entirely, and then slowly disappearing within the living body as though sucked in by its every pore.
Under the influence of such ideas and thoughts, Madame Blavatsky came out finally quite openly with her protest against being called a medium. She stoutly rejected the application of spiritist that was being forced upon her by her foreign correspondents. Thus, in 1877, she says in one of her letters,
"What kind of spiritist can you see in or make of me, pray? If I have worked to join the Theosophical Society in alliance offensive and defensive with the Arya Samaj of India, of which we are now forming a section within the parent Theosophical Society, it is because in India all the Brahmins, whether orthodox or otherwise, are terribly against the boots, the mediums, or any necromantic evocations or dealings with the dead in any way or shape." Footnote: Poots, the simulacra or ghost of a deceased person, an elementary or spook. End footnote. That we have established our society in order to combat, under the banner of truth and science, every kind of superstitious and preconceived hobbies. That we mean to fight the prejudices of the skeptics, as well as the abuse of power of the false prophets, ancient or modern, to put down the high priests, the Caucasus, with their false Jupiterian thunders, and to show certain fallacies of the spiritists. If we are anything, we are spiritualists, only not on the modern American fashion, but on that of ancient Alexandria, with its Theodadictoi, Hypatias, and Porphyries.
The Theosophical Society was founded in October 1875 at New York, with Colonel Olcott as life president, Madame Blavatsky preferring to invest herself with the relatively insignificant title of corresponding secretary. Colonel Olcott's acquaintance with Madame Blavatsky was formed at a farmhouse in Vermont, the house of two brothers, spiritualist mediums named Eddy, famous in the annals of American spiritualism, in October 1874. Referring to her in his book called People from the Other World, published in 1875, he says,
"This lady has led a very eventful life. The adventures she has encountered, the strange people she has seen, the perils by sea and land she has passed through, would make one of the most romantic stories ever told by a biographer. In the whole course of my experience, I never met so interesting, and if I may say it without offense, eccentric a character."
In the year that elapsed between his first introduction to Madame Blavatsky and the inauguration of their joint enterprise, his intercourse with her was intimate and his personal experiences remarkable. These need not be reviewed here in detail, except so far as some of them will throw light upon the circumstances of Madame Blavatsky's life at this period. And for the moment, it is enough to say that they induced him to throw up his professional career as a lawyer. The distinctions between the different branches of the profession in England, it will be remembered, do not hold good in America, and devote his life to the pursuit of occult development as a chela of the same master to whom Madame Blavatsky's allegiance is owing, and to the service of the Theosophical movement. As Colonel Olcott has shared some of the obloquy directed against Madame Blavatsky in recent years, it may be worthwhile to add a paragraph concerning him written by Mr. A. O. Hume, C.B., late Secretary to the Government of India in the Agricultural Department. This passage occurs in a letter by Mr. Hume addressed to an English paper, and is quoted in the preface to the Occult World.
As regards Colonel Olcott's title, the printed papers which I send by this same mail will prove to you that this gentleman is an officer of the American Army who rendered good service during the war, as will be seen from the letter of the Judge Advocate General, the Secretary of the Navy, and the Assistant Secretaries of War and of the Treasury, and who was sufficiently well known and esteemed in his own country to induce the President of the United States to furnish him with an autograph letter of introduction and recommendation to all ministers and consuls of the United States on the occasion of his leaving America for the East at the close of 1878.
In introducing some notes put together for the service of the present memoir, Colonel Olcott writes,
"A strange concatenation of events brought us together and united our lives for this work, under the superior direction of a group of masters, especially of one whose wise teaching, noble example, benevolent patience, and paternal solicitude have made us regard him with the reverence and love that a true father inspires in his children. I am indebted to H.P. Blavatsky for making me know of the existence of these masters and their esoteric philosophy, and later for acting as my mediator before I had come into direct personal intercourse with them."
The earliest records of the Theosophical Society reveal the motives for its formation, which the fuller information since made public concerning the character of Madame Blavatsky's mission show to have been present in her mind from the first, though the means by which she should work them out lay before her then in a very nebulous and hazy condition. She seems to have been embarrassed by the difficulty of making her position intelligible to people who knew nothing of the existence, even still less of the nature and powers of those proficients in occult science, since so widely talked about, the adepts and Mahatmas. Her policy seems to have been to imitate, by means of the occult powers which she either possessed herself or could borrow from her masters from time to time, the phenomena of spiritualism, which then seemed to absorb the attention of all persons in America having any natural leanings towards mysticism, trusting to the sagacity of observers to show them that the circumstances with which she would surround such phenomena were quite unlike those to which they were used. In this way, she seems to have aimed at cutting the ground from under the feet of people inclined to theorize too hastily on the basis of spiritualistic observation, at persuading them that the evidence on which they relied for the maintenance of their opinions did not afford adequate justification for these, and at leading them into the path of a more legitimate philosophical or theosophical research. The policy was undeniably a bad one, and was carried out with little discretion, and with a waste of psychic energy which cannot but be deplored in the retrospect, by occult students who realize the consequences of such waste. However, I merely wish to be sufficiently critical of Madame Blavatsky's proceedings, as this narrative advances, to elucidate the operations in which we find her engaged, and I refrain from the consideration here of the policies that might have been more triumphant. A vast array of unattainable purposes was set before themselves by the little group of friends who organized the new society in 1875. These were enumerated in one of the earlier codes of rules as follows.
A. To keep alive in man his spiritual intuitions. B. To oppose and counteract, after due investigation and proof of its irrational nature, bigotry in every form, whether as an intolerant religious sectarianism or belief in miracles or anything supernatural. C. To promote a feeling of brotherhood among nations and assist in the international exchange of useful arts and products, by advice, information, and cooperation with all worthy individuals and associations, provided, however, that no benefit or percentage shall be taken by the society for its corporate services. D. To seek to obtain knowledge of all the laws of nature and aid in diffusing it, and especially to encourage the study of those laws least understood by modern people, and so termed the occult sciences. Popular superstition and folklore, however fantastical when sifted, may lead to the discovery of long-lost but important secrets of nature. The Society, therefore, aims to pursue this line of inquiry in the hope to widen the field of scientific and philosophical observation. E. to gather for the Society's library and put into written forms correct information upon the various ancient philosophic traditions and legends, and, as the Council shall decide it permissible, disseminate the same in such practicable ways as the translation and publication of original works of value, and extracts from and commentaries upon the same, or the oral instruction of persons learned in their respective departments. F. To promote in every practicable way in countries where needed the spread of non-sectarian education. G. Finally, and chiefly, to encourage and assist individual fellows in self-improvement, intellectual, moral, and spiritual. But no fellow shall put to his selfish use any knowledge communicated to him by any member of the first section, violation of this rule being punished by expulsion. And before any such knowledge can be imparted, the person shall bind himself by a solemn oath not to use it to selfish purposes, nor to reveal it except with the permission of the teacher.
One can readily discern in this formidable array of objects the inarticulate purpose which Madame Blavatsky had really in view, the communication to the world at large of some ideas concerning the esoteric doctrine or great wisdom religion of the East, shining obscurely through the too ambitious program of her new disciples, which might be summed up as contemplating the reformation and guidance of all nations generally, a program which could hardly have been floated in sober earnest elsewhere than in America, where the mere magnitude of undertakings seems neither to daunt the courage of their promoters nor touch their sense of the ludicrous. This volume is indebted to Mr. W. Q. Judge, one of the friends Madame Blavatsky made in the early part of her residence in America, for an account of the miscellaneous marvels of which he was a witness during the period with which we are now dealing. He writes,
My first acquaintance with H.P. Blavatsky began in the winter of the year 1874. She was then living in apartments in Irving Place, New York City, United States. She had several rooms en suite. The front rooms looked out on Irving Place, and the back upon the garden. My first visit was made in the evening, and I saw her there among a large number of persons who were always attracted to her presence. Several languages were to be heard among them, and Madame Blavatsky, while conversing volubly in Russian, apparently quite absorbed, would suddenly turn round and interject an observation in English into a discussion between other persons upon a different topic to the one she was engaged with. This never disturbed her, for she at once returned to her Russian talk, taking it up just where it had been dropped. Very much was said on the first evening that arrested my attention and enchained my imagination. I found my secret thoughts read, my private affairs known to her. Unasked, and certainly without any possibility of her having inquired about me, she referred to several private and peculiar circumstances, in a way that showed at once that she had a perfect knowledge of my family, my history, my surroundings, and my idiosyncrasies. On that first evening, I brought with me a friend, a perfect stranger to her. He was a native of the Sandwich Islands, who was studying law in New York, and who had formed all his plans for a lifelong stay in that city. He was a young man, and had then no intention of marrying, but she carelessly told him, before we left for home, that before 6 months he would cross the continent of America, then make a long voyage, and stranger yet to him, that before all of this he would marry. Of course the idea was pooh-poohed by him. Still fate was too much for him. In a few months he was invited to fill an official position in his native land, and before leaving for that country, he married a lady who was not in America at the time the prophecy was uttered. The next day, I thought I would try an experiment with Madame Blavatsky. I took an ancient scarabaeus that she had never seen, had it wrapped up and sent to her through the mails by a clerk in the employment of a friend. My hand did not touch the package, nor did I know where it was posted. But when I called on her at the end of the week the second time, she greeted me with thanks for the scarabaeus. I pretended ignorance, but she said it was useless to pretend, and then informed me how I had sent it and where the clerk had posted it. During the time that elapsed between my seeing her and the sending of the package, no one had heard from me a word about the matter. Very soon after I met her, she moved to 34th Street, and while there I visited her very often. In those rooms I used to hear the raps in furniture, in glasses, mirrors, windows and walls, which are usually the accompaniment of dark, spiritist seances. But with her they occurred in the light, and never except when ordered by her. Nor could they be induced to continue once that she ordered them to stop. They exhibited intelligence also, and would at her request change from weak to strong, or from many to few at a time. She remained in 34th Street only a few months, and then removed to 47th Street, where she stayed until her departure to India in December 1878. I was a constant visitor, and know, as all others do, who were as intimate with her as I was, that the suspicions which have been breathed about her, and the open charges that have from time to time been made, are the foulest injustice, or the basest ingratitude. At times she has been incensed by these things, and declared that one more such incident would forever close the door against all phenomena. But over and over again she has relented and forgiven her enemies. After she had comfortably settled herself in 47th Street, where, as usual, she was from morning till night, surrounded by all sorts of visitors, mysterious events, extraordinary sights and sounds continued to occur. I have sat there many an evening, and seen in broad gaslight large luminous balls creeping over the furniture, or playfully jumping from point to point, while the most beautiful liquid bell sounds now and again burst out from the air of the room. These sounds often imitated either the piano or a gamut of sounds whistled by either myself or some other person. While all this was going, H.P. Blavatsky sat unconcernedly, reading or writing at Isis Unveiled. It should be remarked here that Madame Blavatsky never exhibited either hysteria or the slightest appearance of trance. She was always in the full possession of all her faculties, and apparently of more than those of average people, whenever she was producing any phenomena. In the month of November, or the beginning of December of the same winter, a photograph was received from a correspondent at Boston by Colonel Olcott, which was the occasion of two very striking phenomena. It purported to be the portrait of a person said to have written the books called Art Magic and Ghostland. The sender required Colonel Olcott to return it almost immediately, which he did on the following evening, and I myself, being there as a caller, posted it in the nearest post box. 2 or 3 days later, a demand was made upon Madame Blavatsky for a duplicate of the picture, in the belief that it would be beyond even her powers, since she had no model to copy from. But she actually did it, the process consisting merely in her cutting a piece of cardboard to the requisite size, laying it under a blotting paper, placing her hand upon it, and in a moment producing the copy demanded. Colonel Olcott took possession of this picture and laid it away in a book that he was then reading, and which he took to bed with him. The next morning the portrait had entirely faded out, and only the name, written in pencil, was left. A week or two later, seeing this blank card lying in Colonel Olcott's room, I took it to Madame Blavatsky and requested her to cause the portrait to reappear. Complying, she again laid the card under another sheet of paper, placed her hand upon it, and presently the face of the man had come back as before, this time indelibly imprinted. In the front room where she wrote, there was a bookcase that stood for some time directly opposite her writing desk. Upon its top stood a stuffed owl, whose glassy, never-closing eye frequently seemed to follow your movements. Indeed, I could relate things apropos of that same defunct bird, but in the words of Juggernaut, we have seen things such as one does not relate for fear of making his readers doubt his sanity. Still we have seen them. Well, over the top of the doors of the bookcase was a blank space, about 3 inches wide, and running the breadth of the case. One evening, we were sitting talking of magic as usual, and of the brothers, when Madame said, "Look at the bookcase." We looked up at once, and as we did so, we could see appear, upon the blank space I have described, several letters apparently in gold, that came out upon the surface of the wood. They covered nearly all of the space. Examination showed that they were in gold, and in a character that I had often seen upon some of her papers. This precipitation of messages or sentences occurred very frequently, and I will relate one which took place under my own hand and eyes, in such a way as to be unimpeachable for me. I was one day, about 4 o'clock, reading a book by P.B. Randolph, that had just been brought in by a friend of Colonel Olcott. I was sitting some 6 feet distant from H.P. Blavatsky, who was busy writing. I had carefully read the title page of the book, but had forgotten the exact title. But I knew that there was not one word of writing upon it. As I began to read the first paragraph, I heard a bell sound in the air, and looking, saw that Madame Blavatsky was intently regarding me. "What book do you read?" said she. Turning back to the title page, I was about to read aloud the name, when my eye was arrested by a message written in ink across the top of the page which, a few minutes before, I had looked at and found clear. It was a message in about 7 lines, and the fluid had not yet quite dried on the page. Its contents were a warning about the book. I am positive that when I took the volume in my hand, not one word was written in it. On one occasion, the address of a business firm in Philadelphia was needed for the purpose of sending a letter through the mail, and no one present could remember the street or number, nor could any directory of Philadelphia be found in the neighborhood. The business being very urgent, it was proposed that one of us should go down nearly 4 miles to the General Post Office, so as to see a Philadelphia directory. But HPB said, "Wait a moment, and perhaps we can get the address some other way." She then waved her hand, and we instantly heard a signal bell in the air over our heads. We expected no less than that a heavy directory would rush at our heads from the empty space, but no such thing took place. She sat down, took up a flat tin paper cutter, japanned black on both sides, and without having any painting on it. Holding this in her left hand, she gently stroked it with her right, all the while looking at us with an intense expression. After she had rubbed thus for a few moments, faint outlines of letters began to show themselves upon the black, shining surface, and presently the complete advertisement of the firm, whose address we desired, was plainly imprinted upon the paper cutter in gilt letters, just as they had had it done on slips of blotting paper, such as are widely distributed as advertising media in America, a fact I afterwards found out. On a close examination, we saw that the street and number, which were the doubtful points in our memories, were precipitated with great brilliancy, the other words and figures being rather dimmer. Madame Blavatsky said that this was because the mind of the operator was directed almost entirely to the street and number, so that their reproduction was brought about with much greater distinctness than the rest of the advertisement, which was, so to speak, dragged in a rather accidental way. About any object that might be transported mysteriously around her room, or that came into it through the air by supermundane means. there always lingered for a greater or less space of time a very peculiar though pleasant odour. It was not always the same. At one time it was sandalwood, mixed with what I thought was otto of roses. At another time, some unknown Eastern perfume. And again it came like the incense burnt in temples. One day she asked me if I would care to smell again the perfume. Upon my replying affirmatively, she took my handkerchief in her hand, held it for a few moments, and when she gave it back to me, it was heavy with the well-known odour. Then, in order to show me that her hand was not covered with something that would come off upon the handkerchief, she permitted me to examine both hands. They were without perfume, but after I had convinced myself that there was no perfumery or odoriferous objects concealed in her hands, I found from one hand beginning to exhale one peculiar strong perfume, while from the other there rolled out strong waves of the incense. On the table at which Isis Unveiled was written stood a little Chinese cabinet with many small drawers. A few of the drawers contained some trifles, but there were several that were always kept empty. The cabinet was an ordinary one of its class, and repeated examination showed that there were no devices or mechanical arrangements in it or connected with it. But many a time has one or other of those empty drawers become the vanishing point of various articles, and as often, on the other hand, was the birthplace of some object which had not before been seen in the rooms. I have often seen her put small coins, or a ring or amulet, and have put things in there myself, close the drawer, almost instantly reopening it, and nothing was visible. It had disappeared from sight. Clever conjurers have been known to produce such illusions, but they always require some confederacy, or else they delude you into believing that they had put the object in, when in reality they did not. With HPB there was no preparation. I repeatedly examined the cabinet, and positively say that there was no means by which things could be dropped out of sight or out of the drawer. It stood on 4 small legs, elevated about 2 inches above the desk, which was quite clear and unbroken underneath. Several times I have seen her put a ring into one of the drawers and then leave the room. I then looked in the drawer, saw the ring in it, and closed it again. She then returned, and without coming near the cabinet, showed me the same ring on her finger. I then looked again in the drawer before she again came near it, and the ring was gone. One day, Mrs. Elizabeth Thompson, the philanthropist, who had a great regard for HPB, called to see her. I was present. When about to leave, the visitor asked Madame to lend her some object which she had worn, as a reminder and as a talisman. The request being acceded to, the choice was left to the lady, who hesitated a moment. Madame then said, "Take this ring," immediately drawing it off and handing it to her friend, who placed it upon her finger, absorbed in admiring the stones. But I was looking at HPB's fingers, and saw that the ring was yet on her hand. Hardly believing my eyes, I looked at the other. There was no mistake. There were now 2 rings. But the lady did not observe this, and went off satisfied she had the right one. In a few days she returned it to Madame, who then told me that one of the rings was an illusion, leaving it to me to guess which one. I could not decide, for she pushed the returned ring up along her finger against the old one, and both merged into one. One evening, several persons were present after dinner, all of course talking about theosophy and occultism. HPB was sitting at her desk. While we were all engaged in conversation, somebody said that he heard music, and went out into the hall, where he thought it came from. While he was examining the hall, the person sitting near the fireplace said that instead of being in the hall, the music, which was that of a musical box, was playing up in the chimney. The gentleman who had gone into the passage then returned, and said that he had lost the music, but at once was thoroughly amazed to find us all listening at the fireplace, when he in turn heard the music plainly. Just as he began to listen, the music floated out into the room, and very distinctly finished the tune in the air over our heads. I have on various occasions heard this music in many ways, and always when there was not any instrument to produce it. On this evening, a little while after the music, Madame opened one of the drawers of the Chinese cabinet, and took from it an oriental necklace of curious beads. This she gave to a lady present. One of the gentlemen allowed to escape him an expression of regret that he had not received such a testimonial. Thereupon H.P.B. reached over and grasped one of the beads of the necklace which the lady was still holding in her hands, and the bead at once came off in Madame's hand. She then passed it to the gentleman, who exclaimed that it was not merely a bead, but was now a breastpin, as there was a gold pin fastened securely in it. The necklace meanwhile remained intact, and its recipient was examining it in wonder that one of its beads could have been thus pulled off without breaking it. I have heard it said that when H.P.B. was a young woman, after coming back to her family for the first time in many years, everyone in her company was amazed and affrighted to see material objects such as cups, books, her tobacco pouch and matchbox, and so forth, come flying through the air into her hand, merely when she gazed intently at them. The stories of her early days can be readily credited by those who saw similar things done at the New York headquarters. Such aerial flights were many times performed by objects at her command in my presence. One evening, I was in a hurry to copy a drawing I had made, and looked about on the table for a paper cutter with which to rub the back of the drawing, so as to transfer the surplus carbon to a clean sheet. As I searched, it was suggested by someone that the round, smooth back of a spoon bowl would be the best means, and I arose to go to the kitchen at the end of the hall for a spoon. But Madame Blavatsky said, "Stop, you need not go there. Wait a moment." I stopped at the door, and she, sitting in her chair, held up her left hand. At that instant, a large tablespoon flew through the air across the room from out of the opposite wall and into her hand. No one was there to throw it to her, and the dining room from which it had been transported was about 30 feet distant, 2 brick walls separating it from the front room. In the next room, the wall between being solid, there hung near the window a watercolour portrait in a frame with glass. I had just gone into that room and looked at the picture. No one was in the room but myself, and no one went there afterwards until I returned there. When I came into the place where H.P.B. was sitting, and after I had been sitting down a few moments, she took up a piece of paper and wrote upon it a few words, handing it over to me to put away without looking at it. This I did. She then asked me to return to the other room. I went there, and at once saw that the picture, which a few moments before I had looked at, had in some way been either moved or broken. On examining it, I found that the glass was smashed, and that the securely fastened back had been opened, allowing the picture within to fall to the floor. Looking down, I saw it lying there. Going back to the other room, I opened and read what had been written on the slip of paper. It was, "The picture of in the dining room has just been opened. The glass is smashed, and the painting is on the floor. One day, while she was talking with me, she suddenly stopped and said, 'So-and-so is now talking of me to,' and says, etc." I made a note of the hour, and on the first opportunity discovered that she had actually heard the person named, saying just what she told me had been said at the very time noted. My office was at least 3 miles away from her rooms. One day, at about 2 p.m., I was sitting in my office engaged in reading a legal document, my mind intent on the subject of the paper. No one else was in the office, and in fact the nearest room was separated from me by a wide opening, or well, in the building, made to let light into the inner chambers. Suddenly I felt on my hand a peculiar tingling sensation that always preceded any strange thing to happen in the presence of HPB, and at that moment there fell from the ceiling upon the edge of my desk, and from there to the floor, a triangularly folded note from Madame to myself. It was written upon the clean back of a printed Jain Sutra, or text. The message was in her handwriting, and was addressed to me in her writing across the printed face. I remember one phenomenon in connection with the making of a watercolour drawing of an Egyptian subject for her, which also illustrates what the spiritualists call a port, or the bringing phenomenally of objects from some distant place. I was in want of certain dry colours, which she could not furnish me from her collection, and as the drawing must be finished at that sitting, and there was no shop nearby where I could purchase them, it seemed a dilemma until she stepped towards the cottage piano, and holding up the skirt of her robe de chambre with both hands, received into it 17 bottles of Windsor and Newton dry colours, among them those I required. I still wanted some gold paint, so she caused me to bring her a saucer from the dining room, and to give her the brass key of the door. She rubbed the key upon the bottom of the saucer for a minute or two, and then, returning them to me, I found a supply of the paint I required coating the porcelain.
I should hardly venture to communicate the foregoing narrative to the public if it were not for the obvious impossibility in editing memoirs of Madame Blavatsky of keeping the various experiences recorded of her within the limits of that which is generally held to be credible. Certainly no one person of those who have had opportunities of observing the phenomena occurring in her presence could hope to be regarded by the world at large as both sane and truthful in relating his experience. But fortified as each witness is in turn by the testimony of all the others, the situation must be recognized as involving difficulties for critics who contend that one and all, near relations, old friends, casual acquaintances, or intimates of her later years, are all possessed with a mania for trumping up fictitious stories about Madame Blavatsky, or all in different parts of the world, and at widely different periods, sharing in an epidemic hallucination in regard to her, while in no other respects exhibiting abnormal conditions of mind. As regards Mr. Judge, with whom I have been intimately acquainted in recent years, long subsequent to most of the incidents above recorded, I am in a position to describe him as a man of very straightforward, simple and earnest nature, steadfastly devoted to the Theosophic cause, in connection with which his experiences, as is the case with many other persons who have been first of all drawn into association with it by Madame Blavatsky, have ultimately developed along independent lines. He is known to many persons interested in the Theosophical movement in London, who would all, I am sure, concur with me in speaking of his character in terms of the highest respect. In the midst of the exciting period of which he writes, he made on one occasion a special affidavit in reference to one transaction. This document is as follows. City and County of New York, namely, William Q. Judge, being duly sworn, says that he is an attorney and counselor at law, practicing at the bar of the state of New York, that he was present at the house of Madame H.P. Blavatsky at number 302 West 47th Street, New York City, on one occasion in the month of December, 1877, when a discussion was being held upon the subject of Eastern magic, especially upon the power of an adept to produce phenomena by an exercise of the will, equaling or surpassing those of mediumship. To illustrate the subject, as she had often done in deponent's presence previously by other experiments, Madame Blavatsky, without preparation and in full light, and in the presence and sight of deponent Colonel Olcott and Dr. L. M. Marquette, tore a sheet of common writing paper in two, and asked us the subject we would have represented. Thereupon, laying the paper upon the table, Madame Blavatsky laid the palm of her hand upon it, and after rubbing the paper a few times, occupying less than a minute, with a circular motion, lifted her hand and gave deponent the paper for inspection. Upon the previously white surface, there was a most remarkable and striking picture of an Indian fakir, representing him as if in contemplation. Deponent has frequently seen it since, and it is now in possession of Colonel Olcott. Deponent positively avers that the blank paper first taken was the paper on which the picture appeared, and that no substitution of another paper was made or was possible. William Q. Judge, subscribed and sworn to before me this 20th day of March, 1878. Samuel F. Speyer, Notary Public, New York County. This declaration received corroborative testimony from another witness, who appends a note as follows. The undersigned, a practicing physician residing at number 224 Spring Street in the city of New York, having read the foregoing affidavit of Mr. Judge, certifies that it is a correct statement of the facts. The portrait was produced as described, in full light, and without there being any opportunity for fraud. Moreover, the undersigned wishes to say that other examples of Madame Blavatsky's power to instantly render objective the images in her mind have been given in the presence of many witnesses, including the undersigned, and that having intimately known that lady since 1873, when she was living with her brother at Paris, the undersigned can and does unreservedly testify that her moral character is above censure, and that her phenomena have been invariably produced in defiance of the conditions of mediumship, with which the undersigned is very familiar. L. M. Marquette, M.D. So much for the circumstances attending the production of the portrait. Now let us see what are its artistic merits. The witnesses are well qualified, Mr. O'Donovan being one of the best known of American sculptors, and, as alleged, an experienced art critic, and Mr. Leclerc occupying a place second to none as a portrait painter.
To the editor of The Spiritualist. Sir, for the benefit of those among your readers who may be able to gather the significance of it, I beg to offer some testimony concerning a remarkable performance claimed by Colonel Olcott and Madame Blavatsky to have been done by herself without the aid of such physical means as are employed by persons usually for such an end. The production referred to is a small portrait in black and white of a Hindu fakir, which was produced by Madame Blavatsky, as it is claimed, by a simple exercise of willpower. As to the means by which this work was produced, however, I have nothing at all to do, and wish simply to say as an artist, and give also the testimony of Mr. Thomas Leclerc, one of the most eminent of our portrait painters, whose experience as such has extended over 50 years, that the work is of a kind that could not have been done by any living artist known to any of us. It has all the essential qualities which distinguish the portraits by Titian, Masaccio, and Raphael, namely, individuality of the profoundest kind, and consequently breadth and unity of as perfect a quality as I can conceive. I may safely assert that there is no artist who has given intelligent attention to portraiture who would not concur with Mr. Leclerc and myself in the opinion which we have formed of this remarkable work, and if it was done, as it is claimed to have been done, I am at utter loss to account for it. I may add that this drawing, or whatever it may be termed, has at first sight the appearance of having been done by washes of Indian ink, but that upon closer inspection, both Mr. Leclerc and myself have been unable to liken it to any process of drawing known to us. The black tints seem to be an integral part of the paper upon which it is done. I have seen numbers of drawings claimed to have been done by spirit influences, in which the vehicle employed was perfectly obvious, and none of them were of more than mediocre artistic merit. Not one of them certainly could be compared at all with this most remarkable performance of which I write. William R. O'Donovan. Studio Building, 51 West 10th Street, New York.
To the President of the Theosophical Society. Dear Sir, my experience has not made me at all familiar with magic, but I have seen much of what is termed spiritualistic phenomena, among the latter so-called spirit drawings, which were thought by the mediums and their friends very fine, but the best of which I found wanting in every element of art. I do not wish to be censorious, but an experience of 50 years in portrait painting has perhaps made me exacting, when it is a question of paintings alleged to have come from a supernatural source. This much by way of preface to the subject of my present note. I have seen in your possession a portrait in black and white of an Indian religious ascetic, which is entirely unique. It would require an artist of very extraordinary power to reach the degree of ability which is expressed in this work. There is a oneness of treatment difficult to attain, with a pronounced individuality combined with great breadth. As a whole, it is an individual. It has the appearance of having been done on the moment, a result inseparable from great art. I cannot discover with what material it is laid on the paper. I first thought it chalk, then pencil, then Indian ink, but a minute inspection leaves me quite unable to decide. Certainly it is neither of the above. If, as you tell me, it was done instantaneously by Madame Blavatsky, then all I can say is, she must possess artistic powers not to be accounted for on any hypothesis except that of magic. The tint seems not to be laid on the surface of the common writing paper upon which the portrait is made, but to be combined, as it were, with the fibers themselves. No human being, however much genius he might have, could produce the work, except with much time and painstaking labor, and if my observation goes for anything, no medium has ever produced anything worthy of being mentioned beside it. Thomas Leclerc. Studio Building, 51 West 10th Street, New York.
The first incident during her stay in America, which seems to have drawn the attention of the newspapers to Madame Blavatsky, was the death and cremation, under the auspices of the Theosophical Society, of an eccentric personage known in New York as the Baron de Palm. Among other eccentricities that he committed, he made a will shortly before his death, professing to bequeath a considerable fortune to the Theosophical Society, but on inquiry it turned out that the property referred to in this document existed in his imagination alone. The newspapers credited the society with having acquired great wealth by seducing the sympathies of this guileless millionaire, when in reality his effects did not meet the cost of the ceremonies connected with burning his body. However, The society and Madame Blavatsky suddenly sprang into local notoriety.
Fancy my surprise.
She wrote about that time to her sister.
I am, heaven help us, becoming fashionable, as it seems. I am writing articles on esotericism and nirvana, and paid for them more than I could have ever expected, though I have hardly any time for writing for money. Believe me, and you will, for you know me, I cannot make myself realize that I have ever been able to write decently. If I were unknown, no publisher or editor would have ever paid any attention to me. It's all vanity and fashion. Luckily for the publishers, I have never been vain.
In the course of another family letter, she writes,
Upon my word, I can hardly understand why you and people generally should make such a fuss over my writings, whether Russian or English. True, during the long years of my absence from home, I have constantly studied and have learned certain things. But when I wrote Isis, I wrote it so easily that it was certainly no labor, but a real pleasure. Why should I be praised for it? Whenever I am told to write, I sit down and obey, and then I can write easily upon almost anything: metaphysics, psychology, philosophy, ancient religions, zoology, natural sciences, or what not. I never put myself the question, can I write on this subject? Or am I equal to the task? But I simply sit down and write. Why? Because somebody who knows all dictates to me. My master, and occasionally others whom I knew in my travels years ago. Please do not imagine that I have lost my senses. I have hinted to you before now about them. And I tell you candidly that whenever I write upon a subject I know little or nothing of, I address myself to them, and one of them inspires me. That is, he allows me to simply copy what I write from manuscripts and even printed matter that pass before my eyes, in the air, during which process I have never been unconscious one single instant. It is that knowledge of his protection and faith in his power that have enabled me to become mentally and spiritually so strong. And even he, the master, is not always required, for during his absence on some other occupation, he awakens in me his substitute in knowledge. At such times it is no more I who write, but my inner ego, my luminous self who thinks and writes for me. Only see, you who know me. When was I ever so learned as to write such things? Whence all this knowledge?
On another occasion again, she wrote also to her sister.
You may disbelieve me, but I tell you that in saying this I speak but the truth. I'm solely occupied, not with writing Isis, but with Isis herself. I live in a kind of permanent enchantment, a life of visions and sights with open eyes and no trance whatever to deceive my senses. I sit and watch the fair goddess constantly, and as she displays before me the secret meaning of her long-lost secrets, and the veil becoming with every hour thinner and more transparent, gradually falls off before my eyes, I hold my breath and can hardly trust to my senses. For several years, in order not to forget what I have learned elsewhere, I have been made to have permanently before my eyes all that I need to see. Thus, night and day, the images of the past are ever marshalled before my inner eye. Slowly, and gliding silently like images in an enchanted panorama, centuries after centuries appear before me, and I am made to connect these epochs with certain historical events, and I know there can be no mistake. Races and nations, countries and cities emerge during some former century, then fade out and disappear during some other one, the precise date of which I'm then told by. Hoary antiquity gives room to historical periods. Myths are explained by real events and personages who have really existed, and every important and often unimportant event, every revolution, a new leaf turned in the book of life of nations, with its incipient course and subsequent natural results, remains photographed in my mind as though impressed in indelible colours. When I think and watch my thoughts, they appear to me as though they were like those little bits of wood of various shapes and colours in the game known as the casse-tête. I pick them up one by one and try to make them fit each other, first taking one, then putting it aside, until I find its match. And finally, there always comes out in the end something geometrically correct. I certainly refuse point-blank to attribute it to my own knowledge or memory, for I could never arrive alone at either such premises or conclusions. I tell you seriously, I am helped, and he who helps me is my guru.
As belonging to the period of Madame Blavatsky's residence in America, mention may here be made of a remarkable incident with which she was closely concerned, though it was not accomplished by the exercise of her own abnormal powers. Prince Emil Wittgenstein, a Russian officer, and an old friend who had known her from childhood, was in correspondence with her at the time of the formation of the Theosophical Society. In consequence of certain warnings addressed to him at spiritual séances concerning fatalities which would menace him if he took part in the war on the Danube, then impending, Madame Blavatsky was instructed by her unseen spiritual chief to inform him that, on the contrary, he would be specially taken care of during the campaign, and that the spiritualistic warning would be confuted. The course of subsequent events will best be described by the quotation of a letter afterwards addressed by the prince to an English journal devoted to spiritualism. This was as follows.
To the editor of The Spiritualist, allow me, for the sake of those who believe in spirit predictions, to tell you a story about incidents which happened to me last year, and about which I, for months past, have wished to talk to you without, till now, finding time to do so. The narrative may perhaps be a warning to some of the too credulous persons to whom every medial message is a gospel, and who too often accept as true what are perhaps the lies of some light spirit, or even the reflection of their own thoughts or wishes. I believe that the fulfillment of a prediction is such an exceptional thing that in general one ought to set no faith in such prophecies, but should avoid them as much as possible, lest they have undue influence upon our mind, faith, and free will. A year and some months ago, while getting ready to join our army on the Danube, I received first one letter, and afterwards a few more, from a very kind friend of mine and a powerful medium in America, beseeching me, in very anxious words, not to go to the war. A spirit having predicted that the campaign would be fatal to me, and having ordered my correspondent to write to me the following words. Beware of the war saddle. It will be your death or worse still. I confess that these reiterated warnings were not agreeable, especially when received at the moment of starting upon such a journey, but I forced myself to disbelieve them. My cousin, the Baroness Adelina von Wey, to whom I had written about the matter, encouraged me in doing so, and I started. Now it seems that this prediction became known also to some of my theosophical friends at New York, who were indignant at it and decided to do their utmost to make it of no avail. And especially one of the leading brethren of the society, and residing far away from America, promised by the force of his will to shield me from every danger. The fact is that during the whole campaign, I did not see one shot explode near me, and that, so far as danger was concerned, I could just as well have remained at Vevey. I was quite ashamed of myself, and sought occasion now and then to hear at least once the familiar roar and whistle which, in my younger years, were such usual music to me. All in vain. Whenever I was near a scene of action, the enemy's fire ceased. I remember having once, during the third bloody storming of Plevna, with my friend, your Colonel Wellesley, stolen away from the Emperor's staff in order to ride down to a battery of ours, which was exchanging a tremendous fire with the redoubt of Grivița. As soon as we, after abandoning our horses further back in the brushwood, arrived at the battery, the Turkish fire ceased as by enchantment, to begin again only when we left it half an hour later, although our guns kept on blazing away at them without interruption. I also tried twice to see some of the bombarding of Gheorghevo, where all the windows were broken, doors torn out, roofs broken down at the railway station by the daily firing from Rutchuk. I stopped there once a whole night, and another time half a day, always in the hope of seeing something. As long as I was there, the scene was quiet as in the times of peace, and the firing recommenced as soon as I had left the place. Some days after my last visit to Gheorghevo, Colonel Wellesley passed it and had part of his luggage destroyed by a shell which, breaking through the roof into the gallery, tore to pieces 2 soldiers who were standing near. I cannot believe all this to be the sole result of chance. It was too regular, too positive to be explained thus. It is, I am sure of it, magic, the more so as the person who protected me thus efficaciously is one of the most powerful masters of the occult science professed by the Theosophists. I can relate, by way of contrast, the following fact, which happened during the war on the Danube in 1854 at the siege of Silistria. A very distinguished engineer general of ours, who led our approaches, was a faithful spiritualist, and believed every word which he wrote down by the help of a psychograph as a genuine revelation from superior spirits. Now these spirits had predicted to him that he would return from the war unhurt and covered with fame and glory. The result of this was that he exposed himself openly, madly, to the enemy's fire, till at last a shot tore off his leg, and he died some weeks later. This is the faith we ought to have in predictions, and I hope my narrative may be welcome to you as a warming to many. Truly yours, Prince E. Wittgenstein, Fellow of the Theosophical Society, Vevey, Switzerland, June 18th, 1878.
Apart from the intrinsic interest of this narrative, it is important as showing definitely, what indeed is notorious for all who knew Madame Blavatsky at the period to which it refers, that she had already, while the Theosophical Society was still in its infancy in New York, declared the existence of the brothers, whom she has been so absurdly accused by her recent critics of inventing at a far later date. The Countess Wachtmeister, whose name will reappear in this narrative later on, sends me another independent account of Madame Blavatsky's doings in America, communicated to her by the gentleman concerned. She writes,
Mr. Felix Cunningham, a young American of large fortune, describes a scene which took place one evening when visiting Madame Blavatsky in America. For some time past, he had been terribly annoyed by certain manifestations which took place in his own presence. Chairs would suddenly begin to hop about the room, knives and forks would dance upon the tables, and bells would ring all over the house. In fact, such a carillon would sometimes be set going that the landlord would politely request him to depart, and he would have to go in quest of another apartment, where, after a few days' sojourn, the same comedy would be repeated, until he felt like a wandering Jew, nearly driven wild by his invisible foes. Having heard of Madame Blavatsky's great abnormal powers, he hoped through her to get a relief to his sufferings, and it was with a feeling of intense curiosity that, having been fortunate in obtaining an introduction to that lady, he one evening entered her drawing-room to find her surrounded by a circle of admiring friends. When at last he was able to approach her, she invited him to sit on the sofa near her, and patiently listened to the long recital of his misfortunes. Madame Blavatsky then explained to him that these phenomena were the result partly of his own psychic force and partly the work of elementals, and she explained to him the process through which he might either rid himself of such disturbances for the future, or else how he could obtain complete control over these powers of nature and produce phenomena at will. This seemed to Mr. Cunningham as so utterly incredible that though he kept his feelings to himself, he classed Madame Blavatsky in his own mind as either a charlatan or a victim to her delusions. What was his astonishment then, when a few moments later she turned to him in the midst of an animated discourse she was holding with some professor on Darwin's system of evolution, and said, "Well, Mr. Cunningham, so you think it is all a sham? I will give you a proof that it is not, if you like. Tell me, what would you like to have? Desire something without mentioning it aloud, and you shall have it." He thought of a rose, there being no flowers in the room, and as the thought fastened itself on his mind, his gaze was directed upwards, and there, to his astonishment, he saw a large, full-blown rose suddenly appear near the ceiling. It descended swiftly but surely towards him, the stalk going right through his buttonhole, and when he took out the rose to examine it, he found that it had been freshly plucked, and that the dew was hanging to the petals and leaves. Madame Blavatsky, who had never moved from her corner of the sofa, looked at his bewilderment with amusement, and explained to him that when once man has obtained control over the elementals, such a phenomenon is simple as child's play.
Some interesting reminiscences of Madame Blavatsky's New York residence are contained in an article published recently by the New York Times in its issue of January 2nd, 1885. The writer, noticing some then current news illustrating the progress in India of the Theosophical Society, says,
"This intelligence is interesting to the general reader, mainly as it serves to recall a most curious phase of modern thought. Its development nearly 10 years ago in New York attracted much attention. The doings of the strange society mentioned in the French flat at 8th Avenue and 47th Street, where they had their headquarters, were widely noticed by the press, and some influence on the thought of certain classes of men and women undoubtedly emanated from the small circle who gathered there. This influence was, beyond a question, the result of the strange personal power of Madame Blavatsky, a woman of as remarkable characteristics as Cagliostro himself, and one who is today as differently judged by different people as the renowned Count was in his day. The Pall Mall Gazette recently devoted a half-column to the lady. By those who know her only slightly in this country, she was invariably termed a charlatan. A somewhat better acquaintance developed the thought that she was a learned but deluded enthusiast, and those who knew her intimately and enjoyed her friendship were either carried away into a belief in her powers or profoundly puzzled, and the longer and more intimate the friendship was, the firmer the faith, or the deeper their perplexity became. The writer was one of the last class. The closest study of a trained New York reporter failed for over 2 years to convince him that she was either a fraud or self-deluded, or that her seeming powers were genuine. That she wrought miracles will be denied flatly, of course, by all persons whom the world calls sober-minded. Yet there are scores of people who will swear today that she did work them in New York. A lady whose brother was an enthusiastic believer in the wonderful Russian, but who was herself a devout Methodist and thoroughly antagonistic to Theosophy, as the new system of thought was then beginning to be called, was induced to make Madame Blavatsky's acquaintance. They became friends, though they continued widely opposed in belief. One day, Madame Blavatsky gave the other lady a necklace of beautifully carved beads of some strange substance that looked like, but was not, hard wood. "Wear them yourself," she said. "If you let anyone else have them, they will disappear." The lady wore them constantly for over a year. Meantime, she moved out of the city. One day, her little child, who was sick and fretful, cried for the beads. She gave them to him, half laughing at herself for hesitating. The child put them around his neck and seemed pleased with his new toy, while the mother turned away to attend to some domestic duty. In a few minutes, the child began crying, and the mother found him trying to take the beads off. She removed them herself and found that they were nearly 1/3 melted away and were hot, while the child's neck showed marks of being burned. She tells the story herself, and in the same breath denies that she believes in any such things. Such stories could be repeated by dozens, and for each one a reputable witness could be produced to swear to the truth of it. It was not, however, by the working of tricks or miracles, whichever the reader may choose to regard them, that Madame Blavatsky made the impress she certainly made on the thought of the day. It was by the power of her own personality, vigor of her intellect, freedom and breadth of her thought, and the fluency and clearness of her powers of expression. Her mental characteristics were as remarkable as her appearance. A more impetuous or impulsive person than she never lived. She was generous and hospitable to a fault. To her intimate friends, her house was Liberty Hall, and while there was nothing sumptuous or pretentious about her mode of life, she lived well and entertained constantly. She seemed physically indolent, but this was on account of her size, which made bodily exertion onerous. Nothing like mental indolence could be noticed in her conversation, and if such a trait had ever been attributed to her, the publication of Isis Unveiled, her work on Eastern mysteries and religions, would have exonerated her from the charge. Without discussing the merits of the book, it may be asserted that the labor involved in its production was very great. As a friend, Madame Blavatsky was steadfast and devoted to an unusual degree. Credulous by nature, she had been imposed upon by so many that she learned to limit her circle. But up to the time she left America, she was always liable to imposition on the part of any designing person. She was unconventional and prided herself on carrying her unconventionality to the utmost extremes. She would swear like a dragoon when in anger, and often used in pure levity expressions which served no other purpose than to emphasize her contempt for common usages. Born, so it is said, of the best lineage in Russia, she had been bred and educated not only as a lady but as an aristocrat. Discarding, as she did, the traditional belief of her family, she discarded at the same time the entire system of European civilization. During her residence in America, at least, for the writer claims to know no more about her than was developed here, she protested against our civilization vigorously. The criticism she drew on herself by this course was merciless, and from a civilized standpoint was certainly deserved. Those who knew her best believe her to have been entirely incapable of a mean act or a dishonest one.
The writer goes on to quote the views which Madame Blavatsky was in the habit of expressing on the subject of spiritualism.
The phenomena that are presented are perhaps often frauds. Perhaps not 1 in 100 is a genuine communication of spirits, but that one cannot be judged by the others. It is entitled to scientific examination, and the reason the scientists don't examine it is because they are afraid. The mediums cannot deceive me. I know more about it than they do. I have lived for years in different parts of the East and have seen far more wonderful things than they can do. The whole universe is filled with spirits. It is nonsense to suppose that we are the only intelligent beings in the world. I believe there is latent spirit in all matter. I believe almost in the spirits of the elements. But all is governed by natural laws. Even in cases of apparent violation of these laws, the appearance comes from a misunderstanding of the laws. In cases of certain nervous diseases, it is recorded of some patients that they have been raised from their beds by some undiscoverable power, and it has been impossible to force them down. In such cases, it has been noticed that they float feet first with any current of air that may be passing through the room. The wonder of this ceases when you come to consider that there is no such thing as the law of gravitation, as it is generally understood. The law of gravitation is only to be rationally explained in accordance with magnetic laws, as Newton tried to explain it, but the world would not accept it. The world is fast coming to know many things that were known centuries ago and were discarded through the superstition of theologians.
She continued.
The Church professes to reprobate divination, and yet they chose their 4 canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by divination. They took some 100 or so of books at the Nicene Council and set them up. And those that fell down they threw aside as false, and those that stood, being those 4, they accepted as true, being unable to decide the question in any other way. And out of the 318 members of the council, only 2, Eusebius, the great forger, and the Emperor Constantine, were able to read.
Talking thus by hours together when the right listener was present, and speaking always as one having authority, it is small wonder that Madame Blavatsky made her modest apartments a common meeting ground for as strange a group of original thinkers as New York ever held. Not all who visited her agreed with her. Indeed, there were only a few who followed her teachings with implicit faith. Many of her friends, and many who joined the Theosophical Society which she formed, were individuals who affirmed little and denied nothing. The marvels which were discussed and manifested in Madame Blavatsky's rooms were to the most of them merely food for thought. If the bell tones of the invisible attendant sprite Pudi were heard as they were heard by scores of different persons, this phenomenon, so minutely described by Mr. Sinnett in The Occult World, was as likely to be chaffed good-naturedly by an obstinate skeptic as it was to be wondered at by a believer. But even the skeptic would shrug his shoulders and say, when hard pushed, "It may be a spirit. I can't tell what it is." If the discussion turned on some marvel of Eastern magic or some fanciful doctrine of Eastern mythology, there was always a witness to the magic and a believer in the mythology present, and there was no one bold enough to deny what was affirmed, however much it might be laughed at. Sensitive as Madame Blavatsky was to personal ridicule and to slander, she was truly liberal in matters of opinion, and allowed as great latitude in the discussion of her beliefs as she took in discussing the beliefs of others. The apartment she occupied was a modest flat of 7 or 8 rooms in West 47th Street. It was furnished plainly but comfortably, but of the furniture properly so called, it was hard to get an exact idea, For the rooms, especially the parlors, were littered and strewn with curios of most varied description. Huge palm leaves, stuffed apes and tigers' heads, oriental pipes and vases, idols and cigarettes, Javanese sparrows, manuscripts and cuckoo clocks, were items only in a confusing catalogue of things not to be looked for ordinarily in a lady's parlor.